Hello and welcome to lecture number 2. Today we'll continue a discussion of Egypt, and we'll also move on to a new topic of new outlooks. A few topics will be addressed in this presentation. First, we'll explore the pyramids of Egypt and why the Egyptians built them. Secondly, we'll address people living in Palestine, these ancient Hebrew people, and particularly we'll look at their Jewish faith. Next, we'll look at the Greeks and provide an origin of Greek civilization with a bit of background, geography, and status for women. So the first topic up for discussion would be ancient Egypt, the pyramids, and their religion. This map identifies Lower Egypt, or the area that's closest to the Mediterranean. The ancient pyramids were located in the city of Ghiza, and that's in the red box shown on this map. When looking at the motivation for establishing the pyramids, I want to start with a concept or idea. First, I want to address the role or function of religion in Egyptian society. There are a few things to be addressed here. First of all, religion helped to explain natural occurring events, for example, the weather and the flooding of the Nile. Secondly, religion helped to provide politicians, because Pharaoh, or the political leader, was the same as a god on earth. Lastly, a particular focus for the Egyptians was that their religion helped to answer questions about the afterlife. In fact, some have argued that the Egyptians were obsessed with the afterlife. Now, do you remember this slide from the previous presentation addressing ancient civilizations? If you remember, Pharaoh was a god on earth. There was no separation of church and state. There was no need for written law because whatever Pharaoh said became law immediately, right when he said it. Pharaoh also ensured that the Nile would flood each year, and that meant that they would have continued prosperity. Here's another slide from the previous presentation. The Nile was the gift for the people of Egypt because it flooded every year, and that nutrients that were added to the soil allowed them to have 2 sets of crops. Much of Egypt is included in a desert, yet this made the area livable, and in contrast to a lot of the instability and the hard work that people in other parts of the Middle East had to put in order to survive, Egypt was particularly prosperous. Due to their religious beliefs, and particularly their wealth, the Egyptians began to experiment with tombs to place the dead bodies of their leaders. This is called the Step Pyramid, and it's from the pharaoh Djoser. This is one of the first Egyptians' attempts to overcome death by building a pyramid. He wasn't able to have a perfect pyramid, that's why the different steps are involved here, but this was designed by an engineer named Imhotep, and it was very successful for its time, but what he ended up doing was he established a school of architecture, and those who followed him were able to perfect this pyramid structure. Now the image you see here would be the Great Pyramid at Giza. It was built by the pharaoh Khufu. It's from about 2600 BC. Not only is the Great Pyramid there, but there are 2 others. It's kind of hard to see the third one. The close-up here shows the Great Pyramid and many of those limestone blocks that were brought in to form the basis of the pyramid itself. Here we see another close-up of the Great Pyramid. It's a physically huge structure that encompasses 13 acres at its base. It was built about 2600, and it's 480 feet high and 750 feet long. The base of the pyramid does not vary in elevation by more than 1 inch. It's also nearly exactly aligned with the points of the compass. It was built with over 2 million limestone blocks, each of which weighed about 2.5 tons. Those blocks were hand carved to fit perfectly into place. Probably took about 20 years to build, with 100,000 laborers. So, why did they build them? Well, the Egyptians believed that every individual's body had a ka, kind of like a soul or a double, and that ka did not die when their body died. One's ka was better able to survive as long as their flesh was preserved. The Egyptians built these pyramids as tombs or resting places for not only the body, but the ka of an individual, so that their ka could be fed, clothed, entertained, etc. Much of the information concerning Egyptians comes from a text called the Book of the Dead. This is a page from the Book of the Dead, and as you can see, it's written in hieroglyphics. These were translated over the years. I'm sure you recognize this wonder of the ancient world. It's the Sphinx. It was carved from a natural bluff about 2500 BC. Notice its proximity to the Great Pyramid. While the pyramids were the resting places for pharaohs from earlier dynasties, in later years, their bodies were placed in the Valley of the Kings. On the left, we see several entrances to a variety of tombs, and on the right, it's the entrance to King Tutankhamun's tomb. The interior of many tombs included images like these. This is the tomb of Ramses II. It's believed that Ramses II was the pharaoh who's depicted in the Old Testament who had conflict with Moses. Never have paintings provided so much for individuals as inside the different tombs of the Egyptian pharaohs. By having these images, these items were actually brought to Pharaoh's Ka. So in the upper left-hand corner, Pharaoh would be entertained by playing a board game. On the right, we see several craftsmen making supplies, because tools would be needed. And on the bottom left, Pharaoh's Ka might get hungry. By having this statue in his tomb, he would have access to grain. Transportation from one spot to another was also necessary. Here we see a model boat complete with oarsmen, ready to transport Pharaoh's Ka wherever he wanted to go. The items shown here came from an Egyptian tomb. These are on display at the Louvre. So, do you know what that arrow is pointing to? Yes, a mirror. Pharaoh's Ka would need a mirror in order to make sure that it looked right. In order to preserve Pharaoh's body for as long as possible, each of the organs was taken out. These canopic jars were designed to hold the organs of Pharaoh. Inside the pyramid would be the sarcophagus where the pharaoh's body was placed. On the left, we see the sarcophagus of Ramses I. Inside that sarcophagus would be a coffin. Often they were made of gold, like the one shown here of King Tut. Inside the coffin would be the preserved body of Pharaoh. Here we see a mummy from about 1000 BC. Remember this slide kind of identifying some of the key traits of Mesopotamia? Well, I'd like to fill it in next with some information concerning Egypt. When it came to religion, Egyptian religion offered descriptions of the afterlife and explained natural occurring events. Pharaoh was a god on earth. Laws were not written in Egypt because whatever Pharaoh said was law, as soon as he said it. The Egyptians were polytheistic. Their code of ethical behavior was based on Ma'at. Their society was characterized by tremendous prosperity, and women had more power and influence than in Mesopotamia and many other ancient worlds. Next, I'd like to look at people living in ancient Palestine, particularly the Hebrew followers of the Jewish faith. While the people living in ancient Palestine to be discussed lived there about 4,000 years ago, they still had an impact on us today. One of the things that they did was they came up with an alphabet that only had 30 letters. The region included in the Kingdom of Palestine is shown here, the colored portions of the map. The people living in the northern part were the Phoenicians. That's where the arrow's pointing. They were the ones who came up with the alphabet with only 30 letters. Have you ever heard of hooked-on phonics? Well, it's called that because the Phoenicians were the ones who developed it. Another factor which shows their influence on us today would be their religion. They were followers of Judaism, or the Jewish faith. This was the first large group to practice monotheism. Again, here's another map to show the region that we're talking about. On the left, we see the Kingdom of Palestine in the ancient world. On the right, we see today's nation of Israel. The Kingdom of Palestine had its origins about 1900 BC. This is when anthropologists have noticed that there was a movement of people from Mesopotamia to the west. According to the Old Testament, one patriarch was Abram, later known as Abraham, who led many of his followers to Canaan, or Palestine. Some ended up in Egypt. In the upper right-hand corner here, we see a depiction of an event from the Old Testament, which is where Abraham was tested by his God, and he almost sacrificed his son, Isaac. Many scholars believe that Abraham was from the city-state of Ur, and he, along with many others, traveled westward toward the Kingdom of Palestine around 1900 BC. Another important figure in the Jewish faith would be Moses. About 1200 BC, it's believed that he led an exit or an exodus of many Jewish followers out of Egypt. He was known as an important lawgiver. An image of Moses receiving the Ten Commandments is also shown on the right. The Jewish religion included many unique traits. We'll discover those next. Most people living in the ancient world were polytheists. Followers of Judaism believed in only one God. Outsiders said, boy, you must have a really weak religion if you only have one God. Followers of the Jewish faith also believed that this God was for everyone, not just for themselves. The God of Abraham and Moses was a jealous God as well. The worship of no other deity was allowed. They also weren't supposed to have any graven images. Now, in an effort to be as open as possible, I've shown a photograph of the altar at the church where I attend. Some Protestant denominations might be uncomfortable with something like this because it shows an image of Jesus, and some might call this a graven image. Just to let you know, I was raised Catholic, and I attend a Lutheran congregation today. There were several other unique qualities of this Jewish faith. First of all, the Sabbath became a holiday. It was a day when Jews refused to work. They were honoring their God on this day. They also had several strict rules concerning meal preparation and certain types of foods that were taboo, like pork and shellfish. The Jewish faith also included the idea that one day a Messiah would come and save everyone. The God for Jewish followers was very demanding. Not only did he want sacrifices and worship, he also required that people interact with one another in certain ways. The lawgiver Moses provided a series of commandments that regulated people's interaction with one another. Just as Hammurabi was given a code of laws by a deity in Mesopotamia, the same was true for Moses. He was given a series of commandments from his God. The Ten Commandments includes a series of do's and don'ts when it comes to behavior. Followers of Judaism were not supposed to murder someone, steal, lie, or commit adultery. One of the commandments also provides insight as to gender relations. Individuals were not supposed to covet, or they were not supposed to wish that they could have their neighbor's house, their neighbor's wife, manservant or maidservant, or any of his other possessions. This gives us a little insight as to gender relations because a man's wife was listed as a possession. These people living in Palestine had several important kings. One was named Saul, another David, and even Solomon. The David would be David who once fought with Goliath, armed only with a slingshot. Solomon was one of these kings of Israel who was known as being very intelligent as well as wealthy. He constructed a temple in the city of Jerusalem on the location of where it was believed that Isaac almost was sacrificed by his father Abraham. Solomon was so wealthy, according to legend, that he had over 10,000 horses. Solomon's temple was destroyed. Only one wall is left standing today. That's called the Western Wall or the Wailing Wall, and it's located in the city of Jerusalem. And you can see those walls today. Here we are back at the chart. Next slide will fill in the blanks, so to speak, on people living in ancient Palestine and their characteristics. The religion for followers of Judaism helped to explain some natural events like the creation of the earth and the universe. It also provided a code of ethical behavior in the form of the Ten Commandments. Laws were written. They also were the first to worship a single God, yet there was no gender equality. Next, I'd like to look at some characteristics of people living in ancient Greece. The ancient Greeks had a major impact on us today. Possibly the biggest impact might have been on their political system, their government. However, their sports, medicine, theater, and other aspects also impact us today, as well as their alphabet. The Greeks took that Phoenician alphabet, reduced it to 26 characters, and spread it throughout the entire Mediterranean. The Greek world was not simply the present-day country of Greece, but all along the coastline, as colored here on this map, of the Mediterranean. Several foods were important for the Greeks. One example would be olives. Olive oil for the Greeks had many, many uses. Now, in this context, the olive oil that we're talking about is not Popeye's girlfriend. In fact, olive oil was used in a variety of ways. First of all, when it was first pressed, they would eat it. Often you would dip bread into olive oil in order to provide moisture. Next, it was used on people's skins. They would anoint it because people's skin would be very dry from the dust and all of the walking outside. They didn't have paved roads back then. With the third press, it would be used for illuminating. So what you would do is you would place the oil in a candle so that you could light up a room. And lastly, it was used for fuel in order to heat people's homes. So many different uses for olive oil. The basis for their diet was bread. A variety of grains would have been used in it. As far as protein goes, fish would have been fairly common, and possibly pork, but pork would have been most common with celebrations. They did keep goats, but those were used mainly for dairy, as well as for shearing the goats and sheep for wool. Honey was used to sweeten their foods. Figs and grapes were grown, but not necessarily just to eat. The grapes were used for wine. Next, we'll look at the geographic layout of different communities and the role or status of women. The polis was the typical political unit throughout Greece. This often is defined as a city-state. Greece was not united under one kingdom. The circled area of this map shows the many different city-states within Greece. Each polis was organized in a similar manner. Most had an Acropolis, which was a high point in the city, usually located on a hill. This drawing is a depiction of what Athens must have looked like several thousand years ago. The arrow is pointing to the Acropolis in Athens. This is what the Acropolis looks like today. It continues to be a high point in the city of Athens. Another section of each polis was the agora. These were locations where public laws were posted. Several days a week, goods could be bought and sold there as well. There was no gender equality in ancient Greece. Each woman always had to be under the control of her kyrios. If she was a young woman and she was unmarried, her kyrio would be her father. Her husband would be her kyrio if she was married. Women's responsibilities were to manage the household and provide a male heir. Women, quite literally, were supposed to remain inside the home. I'd like to quickly review some of the key ideas included in this presentation. Well, there are three primary focal points for this lecture. First of all, it addressed the pyramids of ancient Egypt, the religion practiced by people living in Palestine, that would be the Jewish religion, and lastly, some general characteristics of people living in ancient Greece. What you might want to be able to consider would be different characteristics and daily life for people living in these regions. Well, that's it for today. I hope you learned something new, and I hope you found it interesting. We'll see you soon. Take care.